Several years ago, when I was ordained for only a year, the pastor I was with, Father Doug LeCaptain, down at St. Raphael's in Oshkosh, was holding reviews for all the people that were in the parish, and I was on his list. Being a new priest is very confusing because people even assume when you're in the seminary and you come out a priest that you know everything about everything. People even somebody today asked me, "Father, do you know who takes mass stipends for masses?" And I said, "Nope." I say coming to a parish is like going to a hospital. If you want to find out what's going on, really ask the nurses, not the doctors, because they're on the ground. And so I read the gospel today and reflecting, I remember that story in Father Doug saying, we got to have a talk. You've been a priest for a year now, and it's probably good that we go over some things. Well, what happens when we hear that? Well, immediately, if you're anything like I am, the defenses go up. And you're already making excuses for things that you never actually talked about. Or the pride starts to well up, and you think, how dare he think that I need a review? Most of us carry around sort of this pretense of perfection. But I don't think in any culture anymore in the world needed more correction maybe than our own, and at the same time is so resistant to listening. It's all over, isn't it? Turn on the television, watch a news channel, and watch the news cycles go through. People are arguing back and forth. The reality is nobody's listening. I read an article online recently about a man who said, he was talking about relativism. The relativism is saying that there are absolutely no truths. Nothing is absolutely true. And he said, so I asked the young man, I said, is that absolutely true? And he walked away with a little button popping off his vest thinking, I got the better of the argument. But the reality was the man he got the better of the argument with never changed his mind on anything. Today our readings speak to us about the importance of fraternal correction and about love. You cannot correct somebody that you do not really love. Some people think it's their job to walk around and correct things and point people's faults out, even though they don't even know them. But loving is a function of love, of course, of willing the good of the other as other, right? Love is not a feeling. Love is saying, I want you to get to heaven because I love you. If you don't know somebody, you can't love them. I remember a radio host I know, he'd say that people would come up to him and pat him on the back, says, "Brother, I got something to tell you from the Lord." And he says, "Don't call me brother, you don't even know me." How do we correct people nowadays, especially in a society that more or less refuses to listen? That we do often walk around, myself included, with this pretense of perfection. Well, when I found out that Father Doug was going to give me a review, what could I possibly have done wrong? I know. I felt that pride rise up in me, and I thought to myself, that's not right. Saying to myself, that you got stuff to work on. And if you don't work on it as a priest, it isn't just going to be a family affected. It isn't just going to be a few people affected that you're friends with. Your entire parish is going to be affected with your refusal to acknowledge your weakness. Speaking of weaknesses, I read the gospel so quickly. I usually read the gospel the Sunday before the Sunday I preach, and so I can think about it and meditate it on the whole week as I'm moving through life. Well, I read the wrong gospel on Sunday. And so I've been meditating on the wrong gospel for an entire week, and here I am talking about weakness and humility and recognizing faults. The Lord is very subtle, but he's very loud and clear. Why this progression in the gospel then? If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Why is that? Because it needs to be subtle to begin with. Why? And we already covered that you have to know that the brother has to know that you love him, really. Because you don't want to embarrass people by telling them the truth. I've seen that in meetings. You probably have too. Or somebody calls somebody out right in front of everyone. That's not a good time to do it. Second is, if you try to correct him alone, he refuses to listen, go and establish a few other witnesses. That's probably more or less so the person trying to do the correcting doesn't think that they're just doing it on their own. Like, you've corrected somebody, maybe you thought, oh, I wasn't supposed to correct that person, right? Because I was off base. So 2 or 3 witnesses helps us say, no, we think you're probably right on that. And the third step is going to some real authority like the church. You know, that thing established that is the living voice of Jesus Christ. Which is why the readings this weekend are coupled with the responsorial psalm that says, if you hear the voice of the Lord, harden not your hearts. Where do you hear the voice of the Lord? You hear it in the Scriptures. You hear it at the Mass. You might hear it occasionally from your spouse. They will tell you maybe if it is or not. I don't know. You have to try to discern that. You can even hear it from your children, can't you? I can remember being corrected by a 3-year-old recently, and maybe I shared this story with you already. I was having dinner with a family, and in the middle of dinner, she looked right at me, little 3-year-old Gianna. And she doesn't look at her mom and dad, but she says, Mom, Dad, Father Michael doesn't have any ears. And her parents looked very confused, and they said, Gianna, what are you talking about? And I looked back at them and I said, I know what she's talking about. I know what God is talking about. He spoke through her. I was at that particular time having a very strong resistance to what I believe God was asking me to do. It wasn't sinful or anything, but it was something I really wanted, and God said, maybe something later. I said, no, I want it now, God. You've never done that, have you? No, I want it now. I'm not going to wait. I want it now. St. Paul tells us, as I said before, what love really is. It is not easy to talk to our children, to our friends, to our loved ones about the truth. But if we really love them and we want them to get to heaven, at some point it's going to be necessary. And if we can't do it for somebody else, then at least we should ourselves, because we can control our own behaviors, make sure we are disposed ourselves to correction. Make sure that we don't walk around with a pretense of perfection. How do we do that? The beautiful sacrament of reconciliation. It's where we kneel before the priest as the representative of Jesus Christ and we say, I need some help. I have not listened to God. And before my life becomes a mess, or maybe now that my life is a mess, I'm asking God to please forgive me and make a revolution in my life. Love means willing the good of another. To open our hearts and to be willing to listen to the voice of God. Can we do that? Are we willing to show the Lord our weaknesses so he can fill them up with his strength? No, I trust in you. I surrender. All of these things are ways of saying the same thing. Lord, I can't, you can. So friends, today as we receive communion, make a good examination of conscience, which we're supposed to do at the beginning of every Mass. Brothers and sisters, let us acknowledge our sins and so prepare ourselves to celebrate the sacred mysteries. What should we be doing at that point? Acknowledging our sins so we can celebrate the sacred mysteries. I've got to talk to the deacons about this. Speaking of correcting in front of people. But Deacon Dave, we have a pretty good relationship, I think. I'll tell him the same thing when he's here. But we say, brothers and sisters, let us acknowledge our sins so we can prepare ourselves to celebrate the sacred mysteries. Lord, you were sent to heal the contrite of heart. I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't even make it out of bed, and I was still thinking, trying to acknowledge my sins throughout the day, the little not listenings of God, the little sources of pride. And so for today, friends, our gospel in our readings are asking us to open our minds and our hearts to God's will in our life. And so let's do that today as we receive him, especially in this very intimate moment of receiving him in communion, asking him to fill up in our lives what we acknowledge we lack.